My boss lied. I went to dinner at her house and she told her parents, "We're going to get married." That sentence, spoken in a calm voice over steamed asparagus and warmed bread, landed in my chest like a dropped tray. For a second the room narrowed to the clink of silverware and the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Madison's eyes were steady on her mother's face. Her hand found mine on the table as if to anchor something that had just become very unstable. I laughed once because I didn't know what else to do, and the laugh sounded small and brittle even to me. I should have remarked first that I did not belong at that table. I was 30 minutes late that day because my bike chain snapped and a stranger fixed it for free while I fumbled change from a pocket that never held cash. I was a 27-year-old graphic designer who made grids for breakfast and measured kerning on my lunch break. My life fit into neat columns: commute, work, quick dinner in front of a screen, sleep, repeat. I liked small pleasures: clean fonts, a good cup of coffee, the fog moving over the bridge like a rumor. I owned exactly 3 sweaters that weren't sweatshirts. I knew how to make a logo feel like it belonged to a company without shouting for attention. I was good at my job. Quietly good. The guy the team would call when a deadline threatened to go sideways and needed someone to stitch it back together. Madison was not quiet. She wore confidence like a coat she'd had tailored. At 31, she moved through the studio like someone who could rearrange gravity if she chose to. She ran the design department with a steady hand, quick decisions, taste that made clients trust her instincts, and an eye for the versions of things other people didn't notice. She liked jazz records, twice-boiled espresso, and telling people exactly what she thought in sentences that made strangers believe them. And she had a way of pulling me into conversations at work I didn't think I belonged in, pulling me forward by the sleeve of my shirt in the metaphorical sense, handing me a problem and the half-smile that suggested she believed I could solve it. She told me to come to dinner because it was a small team thing. We'd hit a tight deadline and she said it would be good to decompress, meet her parents casually, nothing to worry about. She said it like a manager saying, "Let's grab coffee." And I believed her because that was what smart, calm managers said. What I didn't expect was for the casual to fold into something else the way paper does when someone presses too hard. Madison's house was the kind of place that read older money but also taste. Hardwood floors, a rug that made the living room feel like it had an opinion, framed prints with minimalist frames. There was a faint smell of lemon and something baking, and the kitchen glowed. Her mother, Linda, greeted me with a hug and fingers that smelled of lemon-scented dish soap and perfume. Her father, Douglas, nodded once and then went back to polishing the stem of his wine glass as if he could buff the entire evening into something readable. Dinner conversations skittered over safe topics: work, the weather, a joke about San Francisco parking, until the inevitable prying came circling. Parents have a radar for the parts of people's lives they feel entitled to inspect. Madison's mother began with the good-natured prodding I'd been warned about by friends who'd been to family dinners. "So, Madison? Any special someone at the moment? Anyone special in your life?" The question landed like a coin on the table, and silence followed while everyone waited to see if it would ring. Madison deflected with that same steady, polished ease she used at the studio. "You know I'm terrible at slow small talk," she said, smiling. "Tell them about the rebrand, Evan. Tell them why our client loved the concept." I stumbled through an explanation of layout choices and color systems that made Linda's eyes light up, as if she were seeing a painting. The conversation veered into the kind of civic pride that only families seem to manage: praise for career choices, for steady work. Then the questions edged toward the personal. "You deserve someone who makes you happy," Linda said casually, like an observation about the weather. "You're an amazing daughter. We worry." Douglas's voice was quieter, but it carried a different weight when he spoke. "You always jump into work, Maddie. Are you avoiding something?" There was concern, sure, but also an ingredient I could taste. History, perhaps, or the way parents hold worry like a ledger of past hurts. Madison's shoulders tightened for a fraction of a second. I watched her as if she were a photograph come to life, and I was seeing a corner I hadn't noticed before. Something about the expression on her face didn't fit the professional armor she wore at work. She looked tired in that way successful people sometimes do, like they had been running a race at a pace they didn't want to stop maintaining. And then she did the thing that broke the possibility of anything easy. She turned to me with a kind of desperate, sharp calm and said to her parents, clear as a bell, "We're going to get married." The words felt like a decision that had been scrubbed raw, not the whispered possibility of future plans, but a declaration. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. Douglas, who had been polishing that glass as if it could smooth all wrinkles, went still. My fork suspended mid-air. For a moment the only sound was the rain against the window and the quiet hum of the oven. "Excuse me?" I said, because the conversational lung burped out something natural and useless. Madison's smile did not waver. She simply tipped her chin as if that gesture could frame whatever absurdity she'd just introduced into the room. "Yes," she said softly. "We're getting married." "Evan, say it." My mouth dried. I could feel the heat rise up my neck. I could make a joke, I thought, say something absurd and disarm the table. Instead, I produced a steady, uncertain, "What?" She squeezed my hand very gently, looking at me as if I were the center of a wheel and she needed to know whether it would turn. "We're getting married," she repeated, addressing her parents as if the sentence would mend whatever had been pulling at their faces. "We're engaged." It was at once the most audacious and the most vulnerable thing someone could announce. There was strategy in it, a way to stop questions, a social suture, but there was also pain folded into the neat word, engaged. It made your ears go tender to listen. I could see it happen in her face, the flash of shame, the fierce decision to smother it with something bolder so it couldn't be prodded at. When you are 30 and someone says we're going to get married in front of their parents and you had, up until that meal, only a coffee date and a swipe of movement in each other's lives, you have a very limited set of responses. You can laugh, you can leave, you can scowl, you can be angry, you can be honest and tell the truth. I don't know you like that. But honesty in that moment would have been an unspooling of a kind of wound I sensed in Madison, something raw and old. So I did the thing I'd never been trained for. I chose not to make it worse. "I didn't know we were moving this fast," I said, and my voice came out like a measured apology. Madison's mother blinked and then, with the instinct of someone who loves fiercely, reached across and patted my hand. "We love him already," she said. Linda's warmth was immediate and disarming and terrifying in its simplicity. If someone warm believes in you, skepticism feels rude. Douglas, on the other hand, preserved his shape like a statue carved at an awkward time. He smiled politely and asked a series of practical-looking questions. "So, Evan," he said, his voice flat with an edge that might have been teasing or might have been a test, "do you have stable employment? Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" Everything about the question was an appraisal. Maybe Douglas had been a man whose daughters had made choices that kept him awake at night. Maybe he viewed life like a ledger, where decisions added up to safety. I told him I worked at Meridian Creative, that my role was graphic design, and that I liked the idea of a career where I could keep making things that mattered. He nodded like a man counting out apples. Later, outside on the porch, the night pressed close and humid. The city lights blurred behind a curtain of steam and the smell of drying parsley followed us. Madison's smile had faded into something softer that I recognized, the confession face. She leaned against the railing, suddenly small, and I could see the tracks of last week's work etched into the corners of her eyes. She told me quietly that when her parents pushed, when Linda asked whether she was dating or Douglas asked whether she had settled down, she panicked. She said something about a past engagement that had folded in on itself and left her wary of being poked and picked apart. She said the questions made her feel like a scandal sheet, and that telling them a story would stop the interrogation. "It was stupid," she said, and I could hear the apology in the word. "I didn't mean to rope you into it." We stood in the dark and the cold bit through my sweater sleeves. People forgive with motions. Madison's fingers curled around mine, idly, the way people reach for a lifeline. I will not pretend I felt brimming affection in that instant. I felt a tight, professional protectiveness and the odd, confusing warmth that arrives when someone you admire reveals the human seams beneath the costume. Her vulnerability was not theatrical. It was something that made the rest of the world fall away for a moment. and I couldn't help folding around that gap like a shield. "You didn't ask me," I said, because I had to give voice to that. "You can't—" The sentence ended because the porch had a way of absorbing words until they felt smaller. "You can't throw someone into a family narrative without asking." She nodded. "I know. I know. I'm sorry. It was cowardice, an avoidance move. I thought if I said it they'd stop, and I didn't want to explain again why I broke up with Tyler 2 years ago." There was a full stop, and then, Will you help me? Just tonight. Say we met months ago, that we were engaged. Don't make it complicated, I'll tell them the truth in the morning." "Are you asking me to lie to your parents?" The words sounded clumsy at my mouth. Madison's laugh was short like a thrown stone. "I'm asking you to save me from an interrogation. Just tonight. If it's unbearable, you can leave. No promises beyond that. Please." We were both balancing on an ethical edge. There was something small and human in her plea that made it easier to imagine consenting. She wasn't a commander issuing an order. She was a person feeling cornered and asking for mercy. That mattered to me, because it respected me enough to ask. Consent in that small moment was present in the only way it matters. I was given an opportunity to say no, and I chose yes. "Okay," I said slowly, "but only tonight. And we're not creating a story that's too far from the truth. I don't want to be twisting reality for a show." She exhaled, and the sound was one I remember like a relieved drawer shutting. "Thank you," she said. "I owe you." She did not, in that moment, promise anything else. Nor did I. We crafted a script like two people preparing to read lines. How we'd met, what we'd been up to, who had introduced us. We agreed not to invent a shared apartment, not to claim we had a mortgage together, not to create children or a past we did not share. We would be engaged, but ambiguous in timeline. It felt valiant in its smallness. The next morning was the kind of awkward that doesn't announce itself but seeps into the seams. At work on Monday, the open-plan studio hummed with the usual clatter. Keyboards, coffee grinders, someone on the phone negotiating a font license like a hostage exchange. The team looked different to me in a new light. I could feel eyes skimming my presence, the way fog skims the bridge. Present and observant, but not solid. People smiled with the practiced warmth of those who have picked up a new fact and don't know where to shelve it. "Big night?" Mark, the jovial copywriter, asked when I walked past his desk. He said it like a question we'd been waiting for before the punchline. I told him it had been carefully neutral. Sarah, who handled digital strategy, raised an eyebrow and nodded like she'd been given a story to file. Rumors are light. They illuminate, and they distort. The office gossip folded me into a new category, the manager's man. That label could be a compliment and a trap. We had a standing meeting with a potential client that afternoon, a regional nonprofit that had just landed a grant and wanted a rebrand to match its new ambitions. Madison led the meeting with that same surety she brought to everything. She walked the room through mood boards, typography choices, and the emotional architecture of the campaign. I watched from my seat, half in the role I had occupied for a while, hands-on, quiet, ready to translate ideas into form, and half feeling like I was wearing someone else's shoes that had just been tried on in public. The nonprofit liked Madison's pitch. They liked the idea of a brand that felt warm and resilient rather than slick and corporate. They asked questions about deliverables and timelines and budgets. Madison spoke, and the client listened. After the meeting, as people filtered out, I stayed behind with my sketches and a cup that had gone cold. The rebrand had the potential to be something significant for the studio, a visible public project that could define our work for months. It also needed someone to thread the details, design systems, responsive patterns, and the kind of documentation that made large, complex roles of identity digestible for clients and developers. I was good at the patient parts. I liked making systems that didn't scream for attention but held up under scrutiny. Over the next week, things rearranged themselves in a slow, believable way. Madison assigned roles, and I got the part that put me squarely in the detail work. It was not glamour exactly, but it was responsibility. Responsibility has a sound all its own, the steady thrum of deliverables, the calendar appointments that begin to look like a map. At night, I would go home with my mind full of grids and color systems, drafting rationales like a person might draft apologies. Madison began asking for my notes, my obsessive adjustments to spacing, and for the first time I recognized the small pleasantness of being needed in a way where my skills mattered beyond the margin. There were whispers, sure. Someone joked about office romance at a Friday beer that turned into a laugh that didn't quite reach the eyes. A coworker sent me a meme with a winking emoji. Another left a post-it that said, "Congrats," with a tiny drawn ring. I took it in with a kind of fatigue, an odd mixture of flattered and exposed. The truth was, the pretend engagement made everything easier in some moments because it stopped people from asking the kinds of questions Madison's parents asked. But it also made me perform a role I hadn't signed up to play in any theater other than the one for our clients. At home, I wrestled with the ethics more than I let on. I told myself that it was temporary, a kindness done for someone who'd shown me professional generosity. I told myself that there was a limit to how far this would go. I also told myself that there was something in the way Madison looked at me when she thought no one was watching. A quiet gratitude, an unedited moment that suggested the line between pretense and true feeling could be thinner than I expected. For a designer, feelings are often like layout frustrations. You pull a margin slightly and suddenly everything balances. I was tentative, repositioning elements of my life to see if they would hold. A month passed like this. Careful, full of small decisions. I built the systems for the nonprofit rebrand like a person building scaffolding you hope will hold a building yet to be erected. Madison called me after a late-night client call and said she had a headache and couldn't sleep. I biked across 2 neighborhoods to deliver a thermos of tea because she sounded frayed. We ate takeout on the studio floor while sorting file names. We argued about whether a logo needed a dash of negative space. She insisted, I compromised, and the result pleased neither of us at first, but grew on us like a melody. The lines between work, care, and something unnamed started to blur. Still, there were tests, small ones that matter. Douglas cornered me in the elevator once at a company holiday party. He said plainly, "I like to understand the shape of things. Are you a person who finishes what you start?" The question was an appraisal of character, not logistics. I told him I was, that I did not give up on things halfway through, and that I found satisfaction in finishing the meticulous episodes of a project. He nodded, inscrutable, like someone filing away data. Madison kept apologizing in soft ways that fell into the language of our routines. "I'm sorry for the way I handled it," she'd say, usually over raw files and late evening edits. "I panicked. I shouldn't have pulled you into that." Her apologies were real, and they came with actions. More transparency, more conversation, a text conversation that stretched late into the night where she would tell me about small things. Her father's garden, a childhood dog named Pepper, a boy she had once loved who left because he couldn't handle her trajectory. The pretense became, awkwardly, the preface for actual knowledge. At work, the nonprofit project became our proving ground in ways neither of us expected. The more I sank into the work, the more I sensed a shift in how people looked at me. Colleagues who had used my name in the context of Evan who helps with grabs began to call me for compositional advice. Our client loved a modifier I'd suggested for color hierarchy, and suddenly it was my idea in the client's head, which meant the credit mattered in ways that led to visibility. Madison would catch my eye across the room and offer a small private smile, not the performative one from the dinner table, but a softer curve that read like permission. Even as things changed, the world kept testing us. A rumor about a possible merger at Meridian floated through like a low fog. Speculation stoked anxieties about job security. Clients shifted budgets, priorities shuffled. For me, the biggest tests were less about the office and more about the unspoken expectations that had multiplied with the pretend engagement. People started inviting both of us to the kinds of events couples get invited to. Neighborhood fundraisers, a friend's wedding shower, a holiday dinner where someone inevitably asked whether we had thought about moving in together. Each invitation was a tiny calibration check. How we responded would either reinforce the ruse or force us into further artifice. I kept asking myself how long we could sustain an arrangement that had no true foundation beyond a moment of panic. I kept asking whether the foundation of anything worth keeping required absolute honesty from the start, or whether some things began as improvisation, and then by slow and steady work, became real. There was an evening, about 6 weeks in, when I found myself assembling a small plant for Madison's living room because the organizer had canceled, and she had mentioned, offhand, that she wanted something to fill the corner that never seemed to have a life of its own. We listened to a record while we worked, and our fingers brushed as we threaded wires through a lamp and adjusted a pot. We both laughed when the plant leaned like it had a mind of its own. It was domesticity by degrees, banal in its details but intimate in the way it filled the silence. In that quiet, bachelor-turned-partner in pretense moments, I realized the odd truth that the lie had done something I hadn't planned for. It had created space for the possibility that two people could, slowly and intentionally, become something more than a rumor. I didn't know where it would go, but I had made a choice, not to run at the first sign of discomfort, not to be a cipher in someone else's story, but to stay and see whether deliberate, truthful work could transform an accidental script into an authored life. If you want more true stories like this, hit subscribe. The rest of that month unraveled into a pattern of small escalations. There were client calls that bled into midnight edits, a presentation to the nonprofit steering committee that somehow went smoothly because our material had a logic that didn't need hype to sell it, and evenings where Madison and I would compare notes about our parents and past mistakes. The office gossip flattened out into acceptance or indifference. People adapted to the new fact as they always do, by living with it without making too much fuss. But the lie continued to create its own gravity. Invitations to family events multiplied. Madison's parents, satiated by the initial pronouncement, began to make subtle plans. Better china, a possible summer reunion where we'll have both of you over. Linda sent me a text one afternoon with a photo of a cake she was considering for an unannounced celebration, accompanied by 3 heart emojis. My chest tightened when I saw it. I was not ready for celebration. I was barely ready for late-night edits. I considered leaving the pretense open-ended and cautious, but with each hush of normalcy, it grew heavier. There was a dangerous inertia to benevolence. People start planning around you, invest feeling, and then your honesty becomes a blow. I thought about telling Madison we needed to stop, that the lie had passed its palliation and was starting to calcify into expectation. I also thought about the kindness I'd promised her on the porch, and how small mercies have a tendency to stretch into something larger. At work, the rebrand continued to take shape. I kept filling the detail gaps, documenting the responsive grid, writing the spec that would allow developers to implement the identity without the art direction getting lost in translation. Madison trusted me with client-facing jargon and subtle pushes in the meeting room, and I protected our designs like a person polishing a lens. It felt meaningful in a way that paid beyond the paycheck, a kind of validation that your particular set of skills can hold a room together. One evening, as I was finalizing a responsive asset set, Madison slid into the seat beside me with a mug of tea and sat quietly. "You're doing good work," she said simply. It wasn't performative praise, nor was it managerial. It was acknowledgement that made the whole night tilt warm. "Thanks," I said, feeling the small, slow bloom of pride. She stirred her tea. "I know I asked you to do something awkward," she said, "and I don't assume we'll ever pay down the weirdness entirely. But I wanted you to know I'm trying to stop making decisions like that without thinking." I trusted her in that small, domestic way that accumulative honesty builds. She had owned the mistake again, not with showy apologies, but with a consistent pivot toward integrity. That meant something. It didn't erase the lie, but it suggested the lie might not be the whole of her. The hours of the coming months would be a test of our capacity to keep being honest, to choose the hard conversations at the right time, and to prove ourselves through the very work we both cherished. I felt the first real pressure, not from the office, but from the life we were accidentally drafting together. One morning I opened an email that would complicate everything further, a note from a recruiter at a rival firm, the kind that always sounds like flattery when it isn't supposed to. They listed a title that nudged at vanity, a salary figure that made my heart do an odd little staccato, and a team that sounded like the next big step. I read it twice, then folded it under my keyboard like a letter you don't want anyone else to see. I thought of Douglas's question, "Do you finish what you start?" and Linda's hand on mine at dinner. I thought of Madison's vulnerability on the porch and the way our fingers had brushed over a lamp cord. I thought of the non-profit rebrand I was shepherding and how small wins had a way of becoming scaffolds for larger opportunities. At work that day, I caught Madison's eye and she raised an eyebrow in a way that asked more than what she said. I smiled and opened my laptop. There were files to send to the client and a grid to refine. The choice I would make about the recruiter would be one of the first real measures of whether this pretense could become an actual commitment, or whether I would keep my head down and move to the next rung. I didn't know the right answer yet, but I did know that the next move would require more than a tidy design solution. It would require conversation, risk, and something steadier than improvisation. I turned back to the screen and started tracing the vector paths, because sometimes action clears the fog better than speculation. The recruiter's email sat under my keyboard like an accusation. The subject line, Opportunity, Senior Visual Designer, Bay Area, was sterile in a way that made the number look fatter on the screen. Title, Salary Band, a list of big-name clients. The kind of thing that reads like an alt text to the life you imagine if you give yourself permission to move. I stared at it for longer than I thought reasonable, and then opened a new draft in my head. Pros, cons, what ifs. The cursor blinked like a metronome. I should have been flattered. I was. I should have forwarded it to a friend and laughed about the absurdity of getting wooed when you barely take compliments. Instead, I stared until my eyes watered a little and closed my laptop, the way you close a book you're not ready to finish. Work that day was a current I couldn't step out of. The non-profit deliverables were due in a week, and the responsive prototypes needed one more round of polish before handing them off to the development team. I buried my throat in the work because there's a particular clarity to pixels. When things are wrong, you can fix them. Human decisions aren't so neat. Madison must have noticed I was quieter than usual. She wandered over about mid-morning with a cup of espresso in her hand, and the look she gets when she's deciding whether it's time to provoke a meeting or let it simmer. "You okay?" she asked, as if reading a weather report. I said something flippant about font weight and told her I was buried in assets. She didn't laugh. She slid into the chair across from me and set the cup down like a small offering. "Did you get something?" she asked, tapping my screen. I showed her the email and watched the muscle in her jaw flex. There was temptation there, yes, because Madison respected upward motion the same way she respected clean gutters on a resume. But there was also calculation. She didn't say, "Go." She said, "Are you thinking about it?" As if the right answer might snap into place if she could only hear me say the direction I wanted. I thought about Douglas's 5-year question. I thought about Linda's hand on mine at that first dinner. I thought about the nights of vector paths and client calls, the tug of being useful. I thought about the unnamed thing that had started as a white-knuckle favor and now hummed with a possibility that made me feel vulnerable in a new, less architected way. "I don't know," I said. "It's tempting. The money is—" I stopped, because that word had the sound of a ledger being slammed closed. "Money changes lots of things," she said quietly. "It doesn't have to change everything, but I don't want to be the reason you feel stuck." There it was, the clean, careful non-command. She wasn't gaslighting or pivoting a hire. She was giving me permission to choose. The ethics of the dinner lived in moments like that, the way she framed a possibility without grabbing my hand and steering it. We talked about it for a while, actually talked like two people who had developed the patience to listen. She didn't say stay because of me. She said, "If you stay, I want to make sure it's because this is right for you." That line, "because this is right for you," became a hinge. I answered a recruiter in the abstract with a courteous decline for a phone screen. I told myself I wasn't rejecting growth, just postponing a decision until I had more data. Then the week took us to the pitch. The pitch day arrived thin and nervous and optimistic all at once. The nonprofit had assembled its steering committee in a sunlit conference room down by the ferry. The room smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and ambition. We rode in the polished conference van with a client liaison who kept tapping his tablet and muttering hopeful things into his headphones. Madison had a calm that morning. I think she slept for the first time in a week, like someone who had hammered the pieces into place and now trusted the structure to function. We set up, and I watched the room fill with people, community leaders, board members, a woman who wore bracelets like miniature trophies for volunteer hours. They brought a seriousness that made my stomach twist into a useful sort of focus. Madison opened with the vision, the thing that made design mean something beyond pretty banners. And then we walked them through the identity system. We showed them the logo in motion, the type in context, the colors that breathed in municipal meeting places and social posts alike. It was the part of our job where we asked people to feel the thing before they could justify it. There was a moment midway through where the conversation drifted toward accessibility, how the brand would translate across different tech platforms and for audiences with different needs. The project's lead on the nonprofit side asked a practical question about contrast ratios and whether the palette would be legible on low bandwidth devices. The question opened a technical seam. The grid we had built looked lovely, but the responsive assets weren't fully optimized for the worst-case scenarios. I felt the old nervousness rise, the wrong kind that makes you play it safe. Madison saw it too. She squeezed my knee under the table, a tiny anchor that was entirely ours. I stood up at the right time, walked to the demo machine, and instead of doing what a nervous person might do, apologize or sidestep, I pulled up an alternate set of assets. It was something I had been noodling on, an approach that prioritized system efficiency over ornamentation. I explained the thinking, how the type scaled, how the color hierarchy respected contrast ratios, how the layout flowed across devices without sacrificing the brand's warmth. I watched faces change. The woman with bracelets leaned forward. The board member who'd been sterilely polite smiled. The client liaison, who had been tapping his tablet like percussion, made a noise that could only be described as approval. We wrapped by showing a simple prototype of the website working on a basic phone, and when it loaded without fuss, the room exhaled like a shared breath. Afterward, in the car back, Madison gave me that smile that used to make my knees a little goofy. Not the one from the dinner table, but the one that landed like a quiet recognition. "You saved us," she said, and it wasn't flattery. It was a record entry. Word of the alternate assets made its way back to the studio faster than our lunch orders. People stopped by my desk with genuine questions about type spacing and asked whether I could show how I resolved certain interactions. The credit came in small ways. Mark pulled me into a conversation and pronounced a joke that landed in actual laughter. Sarah asked if I would lead a short workshop for the junior designers. Madison forwarded an email from the client with a subject line that read, "Excellent work. Please pass along our thanks." Her message was 2 sentences. "Evan, you were brilliant today. Thank you." Momentum has weight. It changed how people shelved me in their heads. Instead of the quiet guy who fixed misaligned buttons, I became the person who could carry a technical, critical piece of a presentation, someone whose work could be trusted in front of clients. A month later, the company had a reshuffle. Budgets had tightened and then loosened in cycles we did not control. That reshuffle produced a promotion for Madison to Director of Creative and a proposed title change for me, Senior Visual Designer, with a bump that looked like someone had finally decided to reconcile my spreadsheet with the visible value of my work. It wasn't enormous, but it was an acknowledgement that matched the extra hours and the late-night mugs. Douglas noticed. He had always noticed things that mattered to him like a cartographer notices a change in shoreline. At the next family dinner, yes, another dinner, because the momentum of a rumor invites rehearsal, he brought it up in a way that was almost performance. "So," he said, poised with a fork, "I hear you're doing better than just freelancing off the couch. You're being useful in a way that lasts?" I told him the honest technician version, that I had taken on more responsibility, that titles are shorthand for the work you already do, that I liked building systems that hold things together. He listened, not with the scrutiny of a man looking for a ledger entry, but with something like interest. He asked about the promotion for Madison like a father assessing a daughter's financial climate. One final check that the landing was stable. After that dinner, Linda pulled me aside and said, half teasing and half earnest, "You've become very good at being present, Evan. Don't let that go." Her praise had the gravity of someone who'd been watching both of us, not from a headline but from the stitches of day-to-day life. Meanwhile, the recruiter who had first reached out didn't go away. A proper polished phone screen followed, an offer of autonomy and pay, and a team of people with names that glittered in LinkedIn profiles. It came in the soft, seductive cadence of a life that promised leverage. Higher salary, cooler clients, streets that included a new index of prestige. I read the offer again and felt that small staccato in my chest like a reminder that choices often come as weights. I took the offer's timeline and put it on the same table as the truth about the dinner, the nonprofit's positive rollout, the promotion in limbo, and Madison's steady apology. I wanted to make the fiscally rational choice, of course. I also wanted to be fair to the person who asked me to help in an ugly, vulnerable moment. I thought about the nights I'd spent aligning margin and making sure the brand we were building could actually be implemented. I thought about the quiet moment when Madison said, "You were brilliant today." I took a walk on a foggy Sunday and tried to map my head like a grid. The fog made the bridge look like an idea rather than a structure. It made distance seem less punitive. Finally, I sat Madison down in the kitchen, this time at our kitchen table, which by then had a stable plant that no longer leaned, and told her what the recruiter was offering. We had that conversation the way designers have critiques, with frankness and with the aim of making something better, not to assign blame. She listened without interruption, eyes tracking the small tremor in my hands when I mentioned numbers. "Stay," she said simply at the end, and then, because a single word persuasion is suspicious, she followed. "Stay if you want to stay. But if you leave, go knowing you made the right move for you. Don't let guilt or gratitude chain you." That was the honest framing I needed. We talked about how staying could look different. More autonomy for me, a clearer line to lead projects, and yes, a conversation about compensation that matched the market. She told me she would advocate for me with HR and leadership, not as a favor but as someone who wanted to build a team she trusted. That phrasing, "build a team she trusted," carried weight. It suggested that the work of our relationship could be communal, shaped by shared purpose and not only by off-hours domesticity. I accepted the rival offer on the condition I could ask for time to negotiate, but I also accepted Madison's plan to advocate in parallel. The next 2 weeks were a study in adult negotiations. I met with HR, we talked promotions, they asked for deliverables and metrics, and I produced a folder of case studies and client notes like a person showing proof that the scaffolding had integrity. Madison sat in on one of the conversations and spoke plainly about the value of a designer who could not only make beautiful things, but also manage the kind of technical detail that made deliverables viable. In the end, the studio offered a compromise that felt more like a recognition than a patch. I received the formal title I'd been given in conversation months before, and a revised package that bridged the gap between what I was doing and what the market suggested. It wasn't everything the other firm had offered, but it was tied to a path, specific responsibilities, a salary that made me able to think in terms of a future where I could save a little more aggressively, and a promise of professional development. More important, Madison's vocal support had made these negotiations plausible without any theater beyond the directness of an honest ask. Douglas called 2 days later. He asked to meet for coffee. We met on a weekday morning in a park near his house, the kind with benches that are good for conversations that need to be civil. He showed up with a thermos and a newspaper folded into a neat rectangle. He didn't look like someone who had declared war on the world. He looked like someone who had held on to enough patience to be careful. "I want to apologize," he said after small talk about the weather, "for the way I grilled you that first night. I've been a protective father. I didn't mean to be sharp." The admission was disarming. I told him I appreciated it and that I had been trying to be honest, that the lie had been Madison's panic and my choice to help. He nodded, as if aligning pieces in his head. "You've shown up," he said finally. "You've proven you don't give up on things. That's important. It's a different kind of promise than a big speech, but it's real." Douglas's acceptance didn't come like a sudden thaw. It was incremental. Measured nods at family gatherings, a call to ask how a project went, and one evening when he asked if I could take his old camera because he thought I might want to learn something about fieldwork. It was small, practical softening, quiet acceptance built from evidence. We didn't rush the truth-telling to the parents all at once. There was a sequence to it. After the nonprofit launch success, after Madison's promotion, after Douglas had coffee, we sat Linda down on a weekday and told her the story. How Madison panicked and how I agreed to help and how it had become something else. We framed it without theatrical repentance and without minimization. We took responsibility, acknowledged the harm, expressed regret, and then explained how we had chosen to be honest and accountable ever since. Linda's eyes wheatened in the way that says someone has been given the whole story and has decided to keep open hands. "We were scared for you," she said to Madison, and then to me. "Thank you for being kind." Kindness here was not patronizing. It was recognition that the improvised favor had a cost, and that Evan's choosing to stay had been an act of care. Douglas, when we told him, listened, tested with a few questions, and then asked one that mattered. "Are you in this because you want to be, or because you feel obligated?" It was the ledger question in different words. I answered truthfully. I stayed because at first it felt like a kindness, but then I realized I wanted to be here for reasons that have nothing to do with obligation. I like the work, and I like her company. I want to keep building what we've started. He was quiet for a long minute. "Good," he said finally. "Then prove it." Prove it. We liked the phrase. It became our unofficial motto. Prove it through durability, through choices that aligned with words. For Madison, proving it meant listening to tough feedback and making space for my voice in the studio. For me, proving it meant stepping into visibility and refusing to duck from responsibility. For both of us, proving it meant sitting with the discomfort of having started poorly and then choosing to try better, day after day. After the honesty, life accelerated into a new pattern of deliberate gestures. We planned a proper engagement. Yes, an engagement. This time not the one typed into place by panic, but the one discussed like a design brief. We talked about what engagement meant to us. Did it mean a ring, a timeline, an alignment of finances? We argued delightfully about options, about whether rings even needed the cultural script they came with. Madison surprised me with a small ring she'd picked that felt like a private joke. Simple, imperfectly round, with a tiny scar in the band that she said made it more honest. We didn't stage a proposal. We sat one evening on the roof of her building. The city fogged in around us like a borrowed blanket, and we said the words properly this time. "Will you marry me?" she said, which was, absurdly, easier now. The ring slid on my finger like a promise shaped by months of small choices rather than a single grand gesture. Her parents came to the kitchen when we called them. We told them first, sitting across from the table where the first dinner had happened, the same clock ticking above the living room. Madison explained the original lie, was candid about how stupid and cowardly it had been, apologized without melodrama. Linda cried too, but we laughed with her quietly because there was such relief in the honesty. Douglas watched, and then he asked how I saw our future. I answered with clarity. We would keep building. We would keep proving. We wanted to work as a team. Plans for a wedding unfurled in the way things do when friends start offering to help. A backyard wedding in the Parker family garden, which had always been Douglas's pride. Neat rows of vegetables and string lights that made the night feel like a small theater. We picked a date that felt like a season instead of a deadline. Invitations went out to co-workers and neighbors and the non-profit people who had become part of our orbit. Friendship gossip at the office evolved into a warm curiosity. Colleagues offered to design booklets and playlists and to work on the floral arrangements in exchange for a story on how the brand evolved. Mark volunteered to give a toast that he promised wouldn't be mortifying. Sarah offered to help with the playlist because she had an eye for transitions. The thing about being part of a team is how people show up when they mean it, not because they have to, but because they want to. The wedding itself was both public and intimate in ways that felt like home. Linda had chosen the cake, 3 tiers, lemon and almond, decorated with tiny piped leaves. The backyard smelled like basil and a grill someone had set up for the night. Fairy lights hung like a slow constellation. It was both low-key and meticulously calibrated, like a design brief that had been lovingly executed. Douglas surprised me by doing most of the seating plan. He steered people into relationships and clinker-free interactions the way he had once polished his glass. He stood when the music softened and cleared his throat as if about to note a city zoning change. What he said was simple and exacting. He told a story about a bridge in town that had been repaired after bad winter storms. How the engineer had spent months reinforcing it, making choices that no one noticed until they suddenly mattered. Then he looked at Madison and me and said, "You've endured a weather that would have tested a lesser foundation. I've watched you, both of you, choose to shore it up. That means something." There was a collective exhale in the crowd, the kind that felt like permission, and Linda cried a little more openly. The toasts were tender without being saccharine. Mark's speech was earnest and funny in the way the best toasts are. He recounted the first lunch we ever took at a diner where the napkins were not metaphorically appropriate, and Sarah read a note from the nonprofit's director thanking us for the care we'd shown. Our vows were short, less about performance and more about promises that sounded like plans. I spoke about proving it, about finishing what you start, about the small domestic scaffolding of life that I promised to maintain. The cups rinsed, the files organized, the listening when she needed it. Madison spoke about panic and apology and the courage it takes to ask for help and to accept it. We laughed and then we kissed, and the fog held the sound like it was valuable. After the wedding, when guests had thinned into lingering clusters and Linda was putting chairs away with the same determined care she used to fold laundry, Douglas found me by the garden hose. He handed me an envelope with a look that insisted it contained nothing less than trust. Inside was a note, nothing financial, just a short line. "Keep finishing things." He clasped my shoulder in a way that felt more like an authorization than an approval, and I felt oddly like a man who had finally learned to read a blueprint. Marriage, like branding, is the everyday work that comes after a clever headline. The months that followed were not epiphanies. There were fights about small things, who left the kettle on, who forgot to file a tax form, tempered by the pattern of repair. There were also long stretches of contentment, Saturday mornings spent rearranging a bookshelf, evenings where we argued about whether a certain shade of blue registered as corporate or humane, and the slow, steady satisfaction of deciding to stay when it would have been easier to move on. At Meridian, the work continued. I was leading a small team now, junior designers who came with their own nervous talents, and I enjoyed teaching the quiet parts of the job. How to craft a grid that actually functions when the device orientation flips. How to write an asset name that makes sense months down the line. I learned to speak the language of leadership without sacrificing the particular nerdy joy of being a designer. Madison and I found a new rhythm at work. Collaborators rather than co-conspirators in a lie. Allies who could push each other to do better. Time has a way of softening edges. People stopped calling me the fiancé, as if that was the essence of me, and started calling me Evan again, with the particularity of someone who had been seen and then catalogued properly. The rumor transformed into history, and then into a footnote. The panic that once made a woman call me at dinner and declare marriage in order to stop a conversation became a story we told with a laugh sometimes, a cautionary tale about how not to handle anxiety. There's a moment I like to return to in my head. The porch that night when Madison apologized and I chose to stay. I don't narrate it as triumph. I narrate it as one of many choices that compose a life. Choosing to stay wasn't a surrender or a sacrifice. It was a decision to be intentional. It was choosing to make the slow, often mundane work matter. If there's any moral to it, it's that honesty matters more than a clever fix. The lie was never the hero. The real work was the aftermath. The months of proving, the small admissions, the daily choices to align word with action. Madison owned her mistake, and then set about making better decisions. I owned my part of the story and then stepped into roles that asked more of me. Douglas watched us and recalibrated. Linda forgave in a way that taught us both what generosity looks like when it refuses to reduce complexity. On the second anniversary of our wedding, we went back to that dining room. the same oak table glowing under the same clock. The asparagus was different, but the feeling of the room was the same. Softer edges, a more honest light. We didn't need to restage the moment. We simply sat where we had once been strangers and watched how life can, with work and patience and apology, turn a frightened improvisation into a genuine partnership. If you liked this story, like and subscribe for more real-life twists.